So picking up on this theme of what happens as a result of tobacco getting to be the crop that sort of saved Jamestown and saved the Chesapeake and I guess therefore saved America, you've got this question of land and labor. Now, of course, you're going to need more and more land moving further and further west into Native American lands because of what tobacco does to the soil as it's grown. But then you're also going to have the question of labor. And one of the first options was Native Americans. Generally speaking, the British did not do a very effective job of using Native Americans as laborers, except for South Carolina, which is sort of an anomalous situation. And African slaves were considered too costly. Now, obviously, at the beginning, there weren't even Africans in the Chesapeake. That's not until that famous year of 1619. And even then, we don't believe they came as slaves at first. So the option was actually to bring over indentured servants, poor white men from England, who otherwise wouldn't be able to make the journey themselves, but they would basically trade the expense of getting to come across plus 5 to 7 years of indenture, working as not necessarily as slaves, but pretty darn close to it. And at the end, they would get their freedom dues, and they'd be free to sort of establish their own lives here in Virginia and Maryland, which ultimately didn't work out. Let's later talk about Bacon's Rebellion as a result of that. But the people that brought indentured servants over were given an incentive, particularly in Virginia, the headright system, where for every person you brought over, every indentured servant, you got 50 acres of land. So if you brought over 500 indentured servants, then you obviously are doing quite well in terms of land, and this is where we sort of get the first quasi-aristocracy in the New World. We're going to hold off for a second in talking about Bacon's Rebellion, which would be sort of the natural place to go after talking about indentured servants and what they did and didn't get. We're going to take a pause to talk about the year 1619 in terms of how noteworthy it was in the New World. So 12 years into Jamestown's development, you're going to see the first major influx, dare I say shipment of women that come in to bring order and stability to, maybe society overall. There were women early on in Jamestown, but never enough to sort of make a true impact. Now, you're also going to see the first representative government, the House of Burgesses. Now remember, unlike in New England where you had everybody close together, you couldn't have people all close together because as people move further and further out for tobacco reasons, they aren't all together, they can't make decisions together, so they end up sending representatives. They will send a person to Jamestown, to the House of Burgesses, to vote on their behalf. And this, of course, becomes the model that we're going to have for our own representative governments that we're going to have both sort of at the state level and at the federal level once we have a nation post-Revolutionary War. In addition, you're going to see the first Africans that are brought in. Again, as I said earlier, there's no reason to believe that they were actually slaves, but soon within 50 years, we're going to see that transition from Africans being brought here and some sort of status to actually being brought here as slaves as a result of Bacon's Rebellion. Now, the issue with Bacon's Rebellion was that by 1670s, you had a bunch of men who'd done their indenture, found that they weren't getting what they thought they were going to get. They lived out west, quote unquote. They were dealing with Native Americans. They didn't feel like they were being given a fair shake by the government in Jamestown. They'd been recently disenfranchised, meaning they hadn't been allowed to vote. They didn't feel like even then they had proper representation in Jamestown. They didn't have wives. They just didn't have the opportunity that they thought that they would get. And sort of onto the scene comes this man, Nathaniel Bacon, who had wanted to be part of the gentry, of the aristocracy in Jamestown, but had sort of been kept out of the old boys club. And so he's going to use this chip that he has on his shoulder to lead a ragtag group of pretty pissed off men against the establishment, the authority in Jamestown. And so in many ways, it's a story of the little guy fighting against the big guy. Ironically, there's a pretty rich guy leading the little guys. It's also a story of, the Native American conflict that we've seen. It's a story of the people on the coast versus the people in the inland. It's a story of, your sort of workers versus your more economic elites. And obviously, it's ultimately leads to slavery. So it's very much a story about slavery. And the details aren't necessarily all that important, except for the fact that Nathaniel Bacon and his men create such fear in the eyes and hearts of the establishment in Jamestown as they ultimately burn it down before Bacon dies of dysentery, that they realize, maybe it's not that smart to have a bunch of pissed off, unemployed, sort of landless white guys that are out there that could always be a threat. Maybe we should look for a class of workers who could be controlled easier. So that's where you're going to really see this transition from white indentured servants to African slaves. Not to say that you hadn't had African slaves before, not to say you're not going to continue to have some white indentured servants, but 1675 is considered the turning point year as the focus becomes now on using a different type of labor source. You can't really finish any discussion on the Chesapeake without talking about what Maryland represents. Now, in terms of its economy, in terms of its topography, Maryland and Virginia are very similar. But while Virginia didn't really have much of an explicit religious focus, yes, they were Anglican. They hadn't broken away from the church. They weren't separatists. They weren't non-separating Puritans. They generally weren't there for God. They were there for quote-unquote gold. And then when that gold wasn't there, they were obviously there for that brown gold, tobacco. But in Maryland, it was different. It was explicitly started as a Catholic refuge. Now, you didn't just do anything for pure religion's sake. There was also a real estate interest, and they couldn't find enough Catholics, who again were persecuted in England because England had broken away from the Catholic Church, that they ended up having to bring in Protestants, and then the Catholics are outnumbered by the Protestants. And then at the end of the day, the Catholics and the Protestants came up with a law that we call the Act of Toleration, which means that basically anybody who believed in the divinity of Christ was allowed. Now, of course, that excludes Jews and atheists and others, but it is noteworthy in that Maryland is different because of its religious focus and also because of, quote-unquote, its toleration. Then we're going to go north. So obviously we start with the Chesapeake. We take ourselves from Jamestown in 1607 all the way through Bacon's in 1675, and then we sort of go in the Wayback Machine back to 1620 as we're going to look at the reasons that people come to New England. And at first, they're coming because they are fed up with what's going on with the Anglican Church. These are people that feel like the Anglican Church is way too similar to the Catholic Church that Henry VIII had broke from, that he did it for his own personal reasons, but he really didn't change much about the actual rituals and theology of the church. These radicals, these separatists, want nothing to do with the church. They go to Holland, they find that their life is too secular there, they go back to England, and then they find their way to ultimately to Plymouth. Now, what's important, of course, about their ride or the end of their ride to Plymouth is that they find that they are out of their legal jurisdiction, and they write and they form the Mayflower Compact, which is not a legal binding document, but more than anything says this is how we're going to govern ourselves. They, of course, remain loyal to Britain, and they, of course, have quite a religious focus. It is not that they're declaring their independence by any means. They're just trying to sort of be good, godlike, and still loyal subjects, while at the same time, not being part of the Anglican Church. The story of the pilgrims that go to Plymouth is really sort of ends there, because we want to focus more on what happens in Mass Bay, because the majority of the people that actually came to New England were your non-separating Puritans, people that wanted to purify the church, but didn't want to do it by separating from it. Yes, it sounds crazy to travel over 3,000 miles to, stay part of the church, but they really didn't see themselves as radical as those people that ended up in Plymouth. They had certainly had problems with the church. They didn't like that the bishops seemed to have so much power. They thought overall the clergy was not that smart, was not that religious, and they basically felt that they weren't being heard from. So as they head to Mass Bay, you're going to famously find John Winthrop with his famous speech, City on a Hill, which we know from A Model of Christian Charity. And as we've talked about many times, this really is this idea that we are destined for something great, and we can show the rest of the world, and particularly we can show the Church of England, that we can have a model Christian community by being together, by really focusing on what we offer to each other. That being said, there is this real fear that what could happen if we fail, and I think that's part of Winthrop's warning to everybody else that says, the eyes of the world are certainly upon you, and we know that this idea of being special and being this model community certainly is something that's going to have a major impact on this greater idea of American exceptionalism that we're going to see throughout the rest of the course. But this idea of being this model Christian community certainly has its benefits in terms of people striving to do the best they can. But it also has this sort of real insular rigidity and exclusivity where if you're part of it, great. If you are a dissenter, well, that's a problem. And so what we have here is we have each congregation in the church, the Congregationalist church as it's known, the Puritan church, allows for each church to operate autonomously, which is rather different than what you saw in the Anglican church, which was very similar to the Catholic church, where there's quite sort of a bureaucratic hierarchy. Now, each minister could help run his own congregation, but he had no political power. But that's not to say that he actually didn't have political power. He had no formal political power, because he could choose who was in his church, and only church members could vote. So by virtue of that power, essentially you had quite a quasi-theocracy, because the government, at the end of the day, required people to pay to support the church. So even if you weren't a member of the church, then you still had to pay to support the church. So you're going to see this sort of, fine line being blurred between church and state. And there certainly were two people that are noteworthy who dissented. The first is Roger Williams, a popular guy who just didn't like what was going on. So people liked him, they just didn't necessarily like his opinions. He felt that the line between separation of church and state had been blurred way too much. He didn't like the treatment of Native Americans. He felt like there hadn't been sort of enough break from the Anglican church overall. And at the end of the day, he was sent away to find, only to find Rhode Island and create, Rogues Island, the sewer, where there really was political and religious freedom that you couldn't find anywhere else. Now, Anne Hutchinson's story, I think, is a little more compelling overall, because Anne Hutchinson wasn't a minister, but she was somebody who knew the Bible and conducted essentially Bible study at her own home and attracted a bunch of people who didn't like John Winthrop, which is a whole sort of different story. And she was called in front of the general court and told that she shouldn't be doing what she was doing. And at the end, she essentially said, I know the Bible better than the rest of you. You guys are not that important. You shouldn't have the status you have, because, why should anybody learn from you? They should be able to communicate directly with God like I do, which is this idea of antinomianism. So this strong woman who took on the religious superstructure in Mass Bay was ultimately banished, ended up in Rhode Island, not surprisingly, but then was killed in New York. Earlier in the lecture, we discussed the idea of steps 1 through 7, particularly as it related to Jamestown and the Powhatans and the on and off conflicts that you're going to see as a result of wanting land to move west for tobacco. In New England, it wasn't as extreme in terms of needing land immediately due to tobacco. It was more, smaller farming with livestock. And so as the livestock gets out and, sort of penetrates into the forest and the open land, you're going to see conflict between Native Americans and whites. And, at first there'd been some sort of, maybe we want to trade, but after a while necessarily didn't want to trade. There'd been some efforts to Christianize, but really sort of decided that the Indians were civilizable. So again, not much sort of direct interaction around anything positive, but it certainly is going to end up in a conflict in 1675-76, which interestingly is also the same year that Bacon's Rebellion is happening down in Virginia. And again, this is a classic step number 7. This is where King Philip, whose name indicates just how much he had adopted British ways, brings different tribes together and says, enough is enough. The only way that we're ever going to be able to sort of save our lives and our civilization and our land is to come together, and they actually are quite successful. Over 2 years, they wrought havoc all over New England and Connecticut and Massachusetts, in Rhode Island. But at the end of the day, the New England colonists sort of get their act together, end up killing King Philip, beheading him, putting his head on a stake in Plymouth, and really sort of ending the threat of Native Americans in New England at that point.